The diencephalon forms a core of brain tissue just superior to the midbrain. It's almost completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres and contains a lot of nuclei that are involved in a wide variety of sensory and motor processing between the higher brain and lower brain centers. It extends from the brain stem to the cerebrum, surrounds the third ventricle, and it includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So here in the picture you can see here, of course, is the midbrain. There's the brain stem. Here is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland. The thalamus makes up about 80% of the diencephalon. It's superior to the midbrain, contains nuclei that serve as relay stations for most of the sensory input to the cerebral cortex, except for the sense of smell or olfaction. It contributes to motor functions by transmitting information from the cerebellum and basal nuclei, or different areas of the brain that we'll talk about shortly, to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. It also plays a major role in the maintenance of consciousness, or remaining aware. It has a crude recognition of a stimulus as to whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, but not a lot of processing details about that stimulus. It also plays a role in learning and memory. The hypothalamus, remember hypo means under, so hypothalamus, under the thalamus, is a small part of the diencephalon that is located inferior to the thalamus. It controls many body activities and is one of the major regulators of homeostasis. As we'll learn when we get into the endocrine system, the hypothalamus has a major role in the endocrine system. Sensory impulses related to somatic and visceral senses arrive at the hypothalamus. Also, impulses from receptors for vision, taste, and smell come through the hypothalamus as well. Other receptors include the continuous monitoring of osmotic pressure, blood glucose levels, hormone concentrations, and the temperature of the blood. So the hypothalamus has a lot of very important connections with body areas, and one of the ways that it connects with other areas of the body is through the pituitary gland. So if you look here, you see the hypothalamus, which has major areas and several different nuclei located within. Each one of these will have a specific function. Now, this is the hypothalamus, and here we have the pituitary gland. Connecting these two is a stalk-like structure called the infundibulum. In that infundibulum, there are a lot of blood vessels as well as axons of neurons that are going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus controls and integrates activities of the autonomic nervous system, so it's a major regulator of visceral activities, including helping to regulate heart rate, movement of food through the gastrointestinal tract, and also regulation of the contractions of the urinary bladder. But in that connection from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus produces a lot of hormones. So it has two really important types of connections to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is an endocrine gland. Endocrine means that it is a structure that secretes chemical messengers that get into a bloodstream and then travel throughout the body to target areas, and they cause an action to occur. So the way that the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary endocrine system, or the endocrine gland, is first the hypothalamus releases hormones that are either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So the hypothalamus releases these hormones. They travel through the infundibulum to the anterior part of the pituitary gland. So releasing hormones will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release hormones, and inhibiting hormones will inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing hormones. Again, when you study the endocrine system, you'll see a lot of these hormones are going to be regulators of the way that the body grows, or producing milk, or helping to regulate some of the sex hormones such as estrogen and testosterone. So the pituitary gland releases a lot of hormones, but the release of those are under the control of the hypothalamus. The second way that the hypothalamus plays a role in the endocrine system with the pituitary gland is that axons from the hypothalamus are going to transport hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. Those two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, are made in the hypothalamus, and then they're secreted down through the infundibulum and stored in the posterior pituitary. So oxytocin is a hormone that's important for helping us to have contractions as we are trying to have a baby and deliver that from the uterus, and antidiuretic hormone, which is helping us to retain water. And in addition to the role that the hypothalamus plays in the endocrine system, it also contains a feeding center, which helps to regulate whether we feel hungry or we feel that we're full, and a thirst center, which helps to regulate our water intake. Also, the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for helping to regulate our circadian rhythm, or the way that we sleep and wake throughout the day. We'll see in a few minutes when we look at the epithalamus that the pineal gland is going to play an important role in that as well. The epithalamus, epi, remember, means above, is a small region that's superior and posterior to the thalamus. It consists of the pineal gland, which we'll look at with a little bit more detail, and another nuclei area or nucleus area that's going to be responsible for some of our emotions as involved with olfaction. So that nucleus that's a part of the epithalamus is involved in olfaction, especially as I mentioned, those emotional responses such as we have when we smell chocolate cookies baking in the oven, or we smell a perfume and it reminds us of our grandmother. The bigger role of the epithalamus is played by the pineal gland, which is a small gland about the size of a pea, and it also is part of the endocrine system. Now remember, we just talked about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus as part of the endocrine system. So the pineal gland, and you can see it here, just a tiny little gland that is a part of the epithalamus. It is going to be responsible for secreting a hormone known as melatonin. Melatonin helps to regulate circadian rhythms. So in response to visual input from the eyes, the pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin in a rhythmic pattern, with low levels being secreted during the day when you have a lot of light stimulating the retina, and higher levels at night when there's less light stimulating the retina. So when there's a lot of light coming into the retina, you have very little melatonin being secreted. When there's very little stimulus to the retina, such as we have in dark, then there is an increased level of melatonin. So the role of melatonin is to help regulate the circadian rhythm. It helps us to know when it's time to sleep and when it's time to wake. It also helps to regulate body temperature. But in addition to helping to regulate the circadian rhythm, melatonin is involved in several other functions. So it induces sleep, it serves as an antioxidant, it inhibits reproductive functions in certain animals. As more and more melatonin is being released during darkness than in light, the hormone is thought to produce sleepiness. So when you take a melatonin supplement because you're having trouble sleeping, then the melatonin appears to contribute to helping to reset the body's biological clock by inducing sleep, and also can be used to help the body to adjust to jet lag. And a final part of the epithalamus is a part of that choroid plexus that we talked about earlier that is going to help the ependymal cells to form and secrete that cerebrospinal fluid. Here we have a nice little table that gives us a summary of the functions of the three parts of the diencephalon. I also want to point out here there is a disorder associated with the pineal gland, and the secretion of melatonin. That disorder is called seasonal affective disorder, or abbreviated SAD. Seasonal affective disorder occurs when there's a hypersecretion of melatonin. Remember, melatonin makes us sleepy, lethargic. We have less energy and we want to lay down. This can be this can induce symptoms of depression, and is most commonly found in people that live in areas where there's decreased sunlight, such as areas of the northern hemisphere farther away from the equator, or the extreme southern hemisphere, which of course is also farther away from the equator, so it's receiving less sunlight. Remember, when the retinas of the eyes receive less light stimulus, they produce additional melatonin, and melatonin again makes us sleepy. So how do you treat SAD? Well, one way to do so is to increase the light exposure. So have bright light bulbs or a light box sitting on your desk or in your work area throughout the day. Also, you can paint your walls white, which help to fool the eyes to think that the area is brighter and that you're receiving more light stimulus. You can also take SSRIs, which are antidepressants that help the body to utilize serotonin better. Serotonin works the opposite of melatonin and helps you to remain awake, and you can think of it as the happy neurotransmitter with those opposite effects of melatonin.